phase of exception in particular, and seeing from a sociological perspective what are the limitation of a discourse around exceptionality, what is left out of that. So in particular the idea is that by framing camps within exceptionality, we basically leave very little spaces for understanding the practice of everyday practice of the residents in camp and the relationship between the camp resident and the space outside. And this is particularly obviously visible in the case of the Roma that I've been working on, and is one of the first actually caveats to this presentation. So when you're talking about nomad camps, so to understand that we're talking of refugee camps is the key point there. The work was done with Kosovo Roma refugees that were settled into camps in Italy that were called nomad camps. So they said a lot of the discussion I'm going to do is about the extent to which bureaucratic labeling affected the way that this group of refugees were institutionalized in the context of Italy, and the extent to which a nomad camp for refugees operated. So that's is the context of my talk. So first of all, just to give you a bit of a background to the presentation. The idea is that there are two key elements that in a way help us to understand the situation, the condition, and the moment in which the Roma refugees arrived in Italy in the 1990s, towards the beginning, in all decades, initially from Bosnia and then later on from Kosovo. And one element is the so-called regional law for safeguarding the nomadic culture, then I'll tell you later a bit more, and the other one is the absence of an asylum system in the country. So there are these two elements. On one end there was basically Italy, while Italy is a signatory of the Geneva Convention for, the Geneva Convention has not, didn't have at that time a system for recognition of the status of refugees that was not only ad hoc, it was basically only ad hoc, and they were dealing with refugees very much with specific responses. There was not a system in place. So when the refugees from Yugoslavia arrived, there was not a way of dealing with them. In the case of the Romans, in an alternative to this void was filled with something else, and something else was a discourse a discourse on nomadism that was applied to the Italian Roman and Sinti in the country. Since the 70s and then more in the 80s, a number of regional authorities in Italy have started to recognize the Roma as an ethnic and cultural minority, and had promoted the regional legislation that was recognizing the right to nomadic life as basically a quintessential characteristic of the Roma. Very closely linked to this recognition, there was the idea that if you are nomads, you have to live in camps. So there was this idea that then regional authorities were funding campsites that they were calling nomad camps, where these nomadic people were meant to be living in it. When the Kosovo refugees arrived, in the absence of the asylum reception system, they were gradually pushed towards the existing campsite for nomads, and there was some very cover page from Italian magazine that's talking about, oh, careful, the gypsies are coming, the nomads are coming, and so basically showing the boats with which the refugees were coming and saying, well, be careful, this is it's gypsy disguised as refugees. So this was the idea that almost as if the discourse around nomadism was making it impossible for them to be refugees, and because of that very reason they were not allowed to have, they didn't deserve a proper reception, but ended up living in these camps. So when I started to do the work, I worked mainly in Florence and in Venice, in camps that were inhabited from Serbian and Kosovo Roma that came during the period of the war. And so that's the initial element. So this is the context in which the way I want to start to work, think about what's the nature of this camp, these encampments, and how I would like to understand them and the way they operate. The research was part of my doctoral research that is titled Ethnography of the Gypsy Problem, Gypsy Problem in Italy. And the idea is to explore the problematization of local population and the way that this problematization leads to specific policy and bureaucratic practices. So in terms of the way that the theoretical framework of... sorry, yeah. So in the next part, after having given this background, I'm going to explore the theoretical framework of the paper. First of all, focusing on the relationship between, maybe I should be speaking next to you. Okay. So now I'm going to skip very quickly the first 4 slides, and I already told it. Thank you. So that's my name, and the structure of the talk, by the way, I gave you a bit of an introduction on the nomad camps for Roma refugees, and in the next part I'm going to focus on the relationship between power, knowledge and space before moving into the different theorizing of the camp space. And then we'll be looking at the empirical materials from my fieldwork, and particularly focusing on bureaucratic visions and the camp. Based on interviews with social workers and various local authorities representatives that were dealing with the Roma refugees. And in the second part on the emic gaze, so the perspective of the Roma about the camps and the way they related to this, the construction of the nomads. In the final part I will try to expand a little bit around the idea of campsmanship and what I mean by it. Just very briefly, the way the justification of this idea of nomadism and discourse on nomadism is very much rooted into the Vander tribe, the idea of the gene of nomadism that the Roma communities were meant to have during the Nazi period and even before. And then has been reinterpreted through a kind of culturalist lens, so then now it's interpreted in terms of cultural essentialist ways, in the sense that nomadism is not biological, but it's really part of the culture of this population. And then I try to illustrate how this developed within the policy making process. When we're talking about the arrival of the Roma, particularly from Kosovo, in the 99, during the spring summer, there were over 10,000 people, and then over the years, both before and after, there's been continuous flows, even on a smaller size. What is interesting today that the way of receiving them, the reception that was structured through the camps, Roma camps, has produced a legacy that is still very visible, in particular in the experiences of kids that were born in Italy to parents who arrived in those periods. And I've recently completed a piece of research on stateless Roma families that basically you have already 2 generations of young people that may be completely without any legal status as a result of the fact that the camp didn't provide them with any residence document. That was impossible to regularize their position. In some cases they were not really registered at birth, and so there is a lot of very extreme situation in which hundreds of people are. So it's not a generalized condition, but there is as part of the result of the camp. So the key element, the starting point here is the relationship between space, as I said, space, knowledge and power. Obviously the work of Michel Foucault around the space as a fundamental of any form of communal life, and space is fundamental of any exercise of power is starting point. But in human geography, this idea has been developed by Lorin Massi around the very intimate and inseparable relationship between space and the social, but also particularly in the work of Engel Nising around the link between becoming political as a spatial practice and a performance of being political. So this somehow set the background of the main analysis. And 2 elements of Foucault theorization are particularly informative. The first one is the idea, nothing new, that power operates spatially, and the role of architecture, planning, as a way of managing the disciplining the other, or specific group of population, but also the micromanagement of spaces. The second element is the idea that social relations don't happen in a void, and they don't overlap. Basically, the social relation happen in a space, in terms, obviously, of the way that camps, and particularly refugee camp, has been interpreted within the literature in the last 20 years. I think, obviously, Michel Ager is one of the main persons has been developing as Alexander was mentioned before, is a really important in terms of understanding the politics underpinning the camps and the link with the humanitarian regime. In these slides, I have linked the camps to the international migration regimes, partly because incorporating the humanitarian regime or the refugee regime into it. Because one element that I find particularly interesting is also the extent to which the camps operate as a way of immobilizing refugees and keep them away, so making them not reach Europe. So it's basically a way of governing the mobility, also in terms of international mobility. So as a form of forced migration as part of a broader understanding of the way that the international migration is governed, both at national and at the global level. Within this understanding of the camp, clearly there is a link that has been pointed out between the humanitarian government and the politics and the discourse underpinning it. But also somehow the facts, and I think the image at the top is really help to illustrate some of this point. This idea of that is the refugee camp is the place where you put the pure victims, and in a sense, almost the sense of isolation from the context. There's something that is in the desert and is regulated so that there is a structure, as a military camp, everything is under control. This is obviously a several rationale behind. There is a logic of security and control, there is an economy of scale of the way that aid is provided, and the work by Barbara Arabond in the 80s about imposing aid is fundamental in understanding the role of the international organization and the delivering of aid. But also I think there is something about the warehousing of people and the way that de facto has become the fourth durable solution that really makes us and pushes us to try to understand what actually is produced within a camp in the sense of the production of political subjectivities. However, as I mentioned before, the kind of literature that I'm more engaged in this specific paper is the one that stemmed from the work of Giorgio Agamben, the Italian political philosopher that is famous for his theorizing of the Homo sacer and the bare life, the space of exceptionality. The idea that the camp the camp as an exception, is a space where immobilization, deprivation of rights, a space of suspension of the individual rights by the sovereign. So it's a way of theorizing it, and what is also interesting for my work is the way that he relates Guantanamo Bay to asylum reception centers in the south of Italy through various different steps. The image that here, the first one obviously is Guantanamo, the second one is Blikendo in South Africa. There was an encampment that was produced as a result of the World Cup, the Football World Cup, when they basically got rid of all the undesirable from Cape Town, and they put them over 20 kilometers away from the city center, and they're still there. And the last one is Castel Romano, is a camp for Roma at the outskirts of Rome. So this is the city center of Rome. The people that initially were living here and they moved here, that is 35 kilometers away from outside the ring road of the capital of Italy, after generations that have been in that place. It's quite interesting how to see what's the logic underpinning some of these decisions and the similarities there. But one of the things that I find interesting is when we think, and this is how also again I present this idea of the camp as a paradigmatic, but the idea is paradigmatic of what is quite important. I mean, what are we talking about? The idea of the suspending, and the way that, and to what extent a paradigmatic thinking works in terms of understanding sociologically the experience of the camp is also another issue for us. The kind of critique that has been moved to this idea of the camp, and in the sense of moving, theorizing camp beyond exception, is particularly pointed in two directions. The idea that the jargon of exception does really leave space for understanding camp resident agency. That's leaves space for transformation. But also it's a way of basically confining in a space which is an exception a very large, a significant part of contemporary life. That's what I will. It's actually one of my motivations for working in this area. So the idea that, as Jeff Eisman says, that leaves a little space for the societal as the realm of the multifaceted, historical, structural, political mediation and mobilization. Carl Levy as well as pointed out the lack of agency, but also more simply the idea that the idea of exception over-dramatized the camp, and by doing so is of little use for understanding the variety of camps in the present. So this is a sense of the camp as the multiple configuration of camps. How do we understand it? To what extent, if we say that everything is in the space of exception, we can really understand the differences, but also how we can understand the different experience of the inhabitants and put I found particularly stimulating Bonioni's call for the exceptionalized exception. And part of this is for reclaiming the space of the camp to democratic theory in her work as a political theorist, but also, as I said, it's a way of thinking about giving again the recognition to the residents as political actors, but also somehow to shift the emphasis and the focus from the exception to the idea of how and in what way this can function within and what role they perform. For example, this is the work of Balipa and Adriansevich, the transformation of the European space and the organization of the labor market. I mean, there's very interesting work done, for example, on the role of Lampedusa as a stopover for the flows of international migrants, specific kind of international migrant that doesn't bring a stop to migration, but is a way of controlling the pace. So it's almost the governance of time of asylum. There is a growing body of literature around this. I found that very interesting. Also, Rigel has worked on the idea of abject spaces, and through which basically we can understand contemporary membership and the way that the position of individual is located within hierarchy of inclusion rather than in an extreme exclusion. So it's a way of whether obviously I'm recognizing the importance of the Agamben work. I'm just thinking in terms of to what extent that kind of framing enabled me to understand some process that I'm interested in, and to what extent this, particularly understanding the everyday life of the camps and the specific configuration of camps in the contemporary world. But more importantly, when I go back to the point about the paradigmatic, what is paradigmatic of the camp? I'm not saying that the camp, I agree with Agamben that the camp is an icon of modernity, and this is a point that a lot of people have made. What I find interesting as well is actually a way through the camp. What I'm interested in is to understand the transformation of contemporary membership, to understand citizenship, but also more broadly the way that people can be within the contemporary world. So if you spend all your life within a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon, I'm not happy with just saying that you live in an exception. That is not enough. So I want to understand the politics and the thing of life. So this was like the framing. Then we will be reflecting a little bit more on what is emerging from my ethnography, and in particular what I'm interested in to show the extent to which the camp, the nomad camp in my case, are embedded discursively, spatially and politically within Italy, within Florence or Venice, or the place where I was looking. I mean, what I'm interested in to so actually to explore these ideas of the political subjectivities of the Roma within camps, and the way that camps become a way of understanding the role within the Italian society, and the way they relate to the Italian society, and the way they are governed. So first of all, the idea, and I will look at the way that the position, I'll try to say something more about the position of the nomad camp in the bureaucratic imagination about Roma. Then I will try to locate the camp within the urban context, and explore the processes of adaptation of residents to the place, And finally, I will try to look at the rights and entitlement that are produced through and by the camp, and the centrality that the camp occupied for understanding the Roma position vis-à-vis the Italian state. So these are the kind of elements I'd like to expand a little bit. So, in terms of the camps and democratic vision, while I mentioned initially the fact that within the regional laws there is a recognition of Roma as nomadic, and as a result of that there is the invitation to local authorities to build nomad camps. They have a specific configuration, there's limits about the length of stay, they have, in some cases there are detailed explanations about the position of the individual caravans and things like that. There are variety, and the anthropologist Leonardo Piasiere has done a very interesting work around the different configuration of nomad camps as well. But what I found interesting, the other element that I wanted to stress was the idea that this idea that the Roma are nomadic is very much deeply embedded within not only political but also the public discourse, together with an understanding of the Roma as dirty, as thieves. There's been the Eurobarometer really shows in Italy a very strong level of prejudices against the Roma people. And these two social workers that I spoke with, in a way, are engaging with that kind of narrative, the idea that the gypsy is dirty. And they are trying to present it in a way that these are very sympathetic social workers that we're talking about. So it really is interesting to see these are not anti-gypsy politicians. These are social workers that they engage with the Roma in Venice and Florence on a daily basis. So the first person is saying, to say the gypsies are dirty is like a dog chasing its tail. If the local authority supplies a camp with one toilet and one single shower for every 50 residents, then it should be no surprise if the toilet clogs up and the shower breaks and the Roma end up dirty. It's a huge vicious circle. Second one point out that just try to imagine a kid from the camp who one morning goes to school and 31 ticks jumps out of his backpack, and you can get an idea of how hard it can be for a kid to go to school. So this idea that there are few elements here which I found interesting about the concept of embeddedness. First one, very clearly, that's the idea that the social worker is positioning the condition of the Roma in relation to a specific policy by the local authority. It's the local authority that built the camp, and as a result of that, Roma are dirty. So first element. But also in relation to the schooling and the education, because another big stereotype about Roma is the idea that they don't want to go to school. So they are trying to position it instead discourse there. What are they not saying? And so they're saying that there are objective reasons why they are dirty. But the other element here is that what they are accepting, though, is the idea that all the Roma live in camps. So implicitly what they are telling me that there is an equivalence between the residents of the camps with the Roma population, which is actually very much part of what is the understanding of Roma within Italian society. The truth is that less than half of the Roma minority in Italy lives in camps, and this doesn't really make a difference. There is an issue of visibility. If we turn and this is particularly striking if you compare to the kind of stories that I got from the Roma refugees about their arrival in nomad camps and how they felt about it. I have no clock, so I don't know how I'm doing it. This Roma man in Florence pointed out how the camp surrounds and excludes its inhabitants to the point that later people say, these are the Roma and they will always be the same. They will never change. So there's a sense of completely othering and also of lack of historicity. Understanding the Roma never changes, something very powerful. And the idea that person engage with it and link it to the fact of being end up living in camps is very important to understand somehow the way that people relate to the Italian state and the distance. But the following two interventions they point out something else about this is about two members of families that were joining their, in the first case the father, the second case is the husband in Italy during in the 1990s, during the war. So the first one says, my dad came to meet us at the train station. He took a taxi that left us outside the camp. I couldn't believe what I saw. "Dad, where is our house?" I asked it. "That's it," he replied. Our house was an old caravan. I stepped in, I still remember that moment. There was one plate, one spoon, one pan, and a fridge with a single tomato and a can of tripe. I put tripe in bold, just because tripe, if you have been to Italy, to Florence, you see that it is almost the national dish of Florence, is tripe. I found that actually was a very good sign of embeddedness, in the sense that in the fridge that is almost empty, the person was adding it. And I can tell you from the Roma, I knew tripe is not really a national dish for the Roma people. It's not. It's actually much more about being in that place. The other person says, I didn't know places like this could exist. I didn't know my husband lived like this in Italy. I used to ask him, "Why don't you take me with you?" I thought he was having a good time. That Italy was a dream, a paradise. This is something that very much echoes what you, every time you speak with the migrants, especially in low-paid jobs, about what they're expecting and what they found in places. It's not particularly original. What is interesting is the sense that these people were living in, particularly one is in Mitrovica, the other one in Pristina, and they were living in houses, and so that when they came in, there was this sense of being lost in these camps, and there was stories about the way that they were affected by the fact of seeing all this group of other people around looking at you, and a sense of social control in the space of the camp, and something about being judged for going out that was particularly important. But after a while, not long after this first impression, people start to get used to places, and this is a process of adjustment, in which what I found important was the way they were relating to the cities they were based in. So in a sense, well, the camp was still unbearable, but the camp was in Florence. And there was a sense of how beautiful it was. Florence, it was really emerging in the stories. There was this sense that when I cannot stand anymore to stay in a camp, I just get a bus and go to the city center. And it was something they were particularly proud of, up to the point that when I interviewed one of the young people that spoke initially, I was asking if you were, would you like to go back to Pristina now the war is finished, and obviously always staying here. There was very much a sense of attachment to the cities, the friends, the network that they built. Florence is really beautiful, even if the place we live in is worse than the one I left in Kosovo. Here in Italy, I feel freer. I feel like I opened up my eyes. In Kosovo, I was like a slave. I had to ask my parents-in-law permission for everything. So it's clearly a sense that they are also embedding themselves in the kind of sense of social norms that are part of the place, which I found interesting. The photo here, was one of my main informants, Adam, and what I want to draw your attention is this. This is a cover of Paris Match, the magazine, with Tito and his wife sitting on a bench, and Adam was living in two caravans with his wife and 3 kids and a grandson, and one of the caravans was completely occupied by piles of books and photocopies and piece of papers, like the one that you see here. And the other one, they were living in the family, so there was almost allocated the same space for his collection of books, some about the story of Roma, other about his life in Yugoslavia. There was plenty of photos about the house in Mitrovica that was burned. But there was this sense of reclaiming his past history against the reality of the camp that was creating them as a mass, as the indistinct gypsy. So he was reclaiming his story. He was had been working in a trade union organization, and so he was, and now he was working as an activist in Florence. But I find interesting the photo, and this is part of another story. The same photos of Tito I found on a wall in Leposavic in the north of Kosovo in 2008, so 2-3 years after that, and this was among Kosovo Roma refugees that were living in an area, and this attachment to Tito and that's Yugoslavia is a very interesting stories about the Roma diaspora, and this somewhere right. But this sense of about the recognition or attachment to the places that was so the elements though that are also interesting in the work I've been doing is this idea of what's the consequence of the camp. So again, about what is produced through the camp, in terms also the embodiment of the experience. I work also with young people and kids, and the research I've been doing on stateless Roma is particularly important, the legacy of the camp on their experiences, and there's been interesting work done by epidemiologists about the impact of the camps in terms of the health, particularly of young people. So there's almost a very basic material sense of what historical embodiment. So as a generation within a camp produces changes, but also produces cultural difference. This is something quite problematic also in the debate about Roma and Noma camps in Italy. This idea that while I'm so to say that Noma camp is an invention produced by the policy, on the other hand, I have to find a way of acknowledging the fact that there have been families living in so-called Noma camps for 20, 30 years. And kids are born in camps, and they have no really space for exit. So how do we think about the possibilities? How do we understand the agents? It's really, I think, important to move on. So just going towards the conclusion. So the idea of councilship again, I mean, it's a term with which I would capture two processes. One is the irreducible spatiality of social relation and politics, and power. On the other hand is the specificity of the camp. So the camps have a role in contemporary societies. They are a form that is replicated in different settings, and they seem to be playing various with different configurations. So in a sense, I wanted to indicate and capture this idea of a form of membership produced in interaction between the individuals, the states, or the other subjects, and a specific form of space. And the way that it seems to be working in the case of Roma is through sort of three main characteristics. The camp operates as a form of protection, of recognition, but also anonymity. And there is an embedded ambiguities in the way that the camp operates. In the sense that he makes at the same time individual invisible and yet project the Roma as a collective into the public imagination. As I was saying, everyone seems to associate the Roma with the camp president. And as a Roma activist pointed out, Roma have understood that concentration can offer some benefit. On one end, an individual, even without paper, can disappear in the mass and live undisturbed. On the other hand, concentration makes the Roma visible as a political issue and is a reminder that there are people waiting for a recognition of their rights. However, the consequences of anonymity is also the loss of individuality. The camp turned residents into an undifferentiated and homogeneous gypsy collective. As pointed out in the history of the camps by Kodak and Rigolo, the camp concerned masses and produced masses. In other words, the dominant discourse on Roma as nomadic people refusing any form of integration in the settled society produced the camp and its system of governance in turn reified the discourse, fulfilling its prophecy by regulating and mediating the interaction between the inmates and the outside world. As one of the interviewees gave an interesting example of this process, of the way that the camp operates. In this case, offering a form of protection to some, while at the same time spreading the blame of their crime on the collectivity. As Emir said, there are many Roma in the camp working in the drug business. I'm not denying it. But if they were in Germany or in UK, what would happen to them? The law would make a distinction between honest Roma, honest people, and criminals. While in Italy, this is not the case, it's the underlying concept. I know that probably this is an idealized version of what happened in France and Germany, but this is how it looks from the perspective of a Roma camp in Italy. And it's also telling us something more about the understanding from the perspective of an inhabitant of a camp, of the idea that racism and injustice are currency in the everyday life of the Roma people and what they can expect. And this is also why the camp is playing the other role, the role of protection. So the camp became, in particular condition, a place where they can sort of hide, to understand from the pressure that comes from the institutional racism and non-institutional one. But this also means that the camp, they are neither extraterritorial, so as I said, they are really embedded in Florence, as well in Italy, and the discourse and the prejudice in there, but they are not an exception as well. In a way to understand the normality of camps, you have the reworking of these spaces and the role they play in shaping the spaces of being political. It may be useful to return to how the Kosovo Roma came to find protection and recognition for them. During the 1990s, under pressure from activists and advocacy groups, local authorities gradually began to acknowledge the presence of the Roma forced migrants and to register the inhabitants of nomad camps as local residents. This acted mainly for residents of official nomad camps, but gradually this provision were extended also to residents in unofficial nomad camps, so they were gradually regularized. By attaching some entitlement and the promise of legal status to a nomad camp, the local authorities made camps appealing to newcomers. However, there were limited places and high demands also created competition among the Roma, which sometimes led to open conflict in particular times of large arrival. For those who succeeded in getting a place, staying in an official camp made it easier to renew the residence permits, also because local authorities often intervened as a guarantor against the police that is in charge for giving the immigration permit even. And it was very interesting to speak to some of the local social workers and the way that they mediated the relationship with the police and about the legal status. And one of them told me in Florence, we had to negotiate an informal agreement with the immigration police, and eventually they issued a special certificate with special stamp, altogether a real exception that gave the family the possibility to stay in Italy for family reasons. So there is two special and one exception. So in a way I'm contradicting myself about this exceptionality element. But is it really an exception? Is it worth noticing that it happened also because rather than applying for asylum, the Kosovo Roma were routinely advised by NGOs and local authorities to convert their initial humanitarian permit into a work permit, because the work permit was easier to get and was lasting longer at that point. What happened though was that after a couple of years there was a change in the immigration legislation. There was a new law called Bossi-Fini from the name of the leader of the Northern League and the leader of the post-fascist party, which made the renewal of labor-based immigration permit much more difficult and was much more subject to the fact of having a contract. And if you were not having a job for 6 months, you were losing the resident permit. So what happened was that people that could have gone through the asylum process, if there was one, and if they were better advised, they end up being extremely precarious. And at that point, what happened was that the camp that they were there became once again a safe haven for them. So there was people that tried to leave the camp, they just went back. So the camp was there, was providing this net of protection for the Roma and the members of their family. This idea within the Italian context is actually not an exception at all. I mean, Nando Sigona has spoken about the localism of rights within Italy, and this idea of soft rights that are produced at the local authority level. And within the studies of migration within Italy, it's very clear that there is a lot of parochialism in the way that the entitlements are produced and by local authorities and the relationship with the central government. Again, a social worker I spoke to said, of course, by law, the local authority cannot offer shelter to people without paper. In this case, we're talking of this Roma that lost the right to stay. In reality, over the years, we have given shelter to thousands of illegals, because our approach as a local authorities has always been characterized by welcoming attitudes. That's quite an interesting statement about the production of rights by being there. Even more interesting is what a civil servant in Venice said. Well, these are political decisions. We approach the issue in this way. If today, according to the criteria that we have as a local authority chosen, I certify that you are entitled to some kind of assistance, I'm not going to let someone else with the refugee status to turn up here and take your place. So this was interesting. Since the entitlement produced by the presence at the local level was overcoming the recognition of former refugees. And a lot of time I heard these stories about how uncomfortable were local authorities with these former refugees that were basically arriving parachuted by the government, the central government in that place, and you know how the idea that if you have been there for 15 years waiting for a house, you are more entitled than anyway. I don't care about the legal status. But again, it's telling us something about the different level of rationalities, the link with the scale of governments. Yeah. So the camp is a protected and protective environment, a safer haven for individuals living in protracted condition of insecure legal status and economic marginality. Intra-community support and local welfare provide the basis of residents' livelihood. In the camp, the boundaries between entitlement and concession, rights and charity are blurred. The inmates cope on a daily basis with a situation of extreme power asymmetry and the permanent threat of being swept away if or when the local political circumstances change. And the idea is that if you get closer to the camp and the inhabitants through the adoption of a more qualitative or ethnographic perspective, what you can see is that rights, entitlement, obligation, and protocol are shaped and bended, adjusted, and neglected, and activated by everyday practice and interaction with the inmates and various actors outside, the local authorities, the third sectors, the state, the police, which really makes the sense, the fact that them in the camp, one of the crucial elements in this negotiation, is it give them a presence, a visible presence. So, just to conclude, I think that the idea of campsmanship is a way of enabling to capture the secretness of power relation, the significance of the camp as a normal technology of power for disciplining the unwanted people. Here also, the idea of unwanted migrants and unwanted residents is also something that has been developed by Christian Jotke in reflecting on the way that the states deal with illegal migrants and why they provide them with entitlements. Why should they do it? It offers also a lens for exploring the relationship between the state and the camp residents, which recognize everyday practice of resistance, appropriation, and adaptation. So the idea of agency, I think it was not really strong within Agamben approach. And create a discursive space for the emergence of local rights and the presence, and the idea of presence as a source of entitlement, a sense of historicity of membership somehow. So we're not talking of citizenship in abstract. We're not talking, when I talk about campsmanship, it's not a paradigmatic concept. It's actually an historically and materially based idea, the idea that you produce by the presence over time a different level of entitlement. And however, it doesn't assume a sense of homogeneity of experiences, as the space-power relations is dynamic and grounded in specific historical and material circumstances. Thank you.
Interesting for who works with camps or encampments in general, and for who works with so-called Roma people. And both questions are present, and the ambivalence of the definition of the situation by the administration, Italian administration, that is this cultural minority place, or is this a refugee camp? Is resuming very well, and in the same time the conflict and the misunderstanding that in Europe the situation of Roma migrants are producing. Many points I would like to touch. It is and it is not an exception, presumably. It is and it is not an exception. That would mean also for social scientists, what can we do with Agamben? Because we must say that Agamben is a wonderful philosopher, and everybody has been touched by the lecture of Agamben, Homo sapiens, for example. We must not throw away the baby with the water of the baby. There is some idea that we can keep. I think a certain idea of something about exception is interesting. because we need to, if we want to be analytics and ethnography, we need to have some concept that help us to say, oh yes, this is about this object, which is camp and continent, where there is something different from a neighborhood, a camp, or a bidonville, or a favela, although it is very near. And why should we study camps if it was so exactly the same than a bidonville or a favela? Then we need some concept to give meaning to the observations that we say, oh, this is different. And then when you are inside the camp, you say, oh, this is like a city. We use metaphors like a city. Or when very frequently it is like a favela. We spoke about Palestinian camp. Palestinian camp are a very densified neighborhood of excluded people living with informal economy and excluded from the citizen, the political citizenship. All this needs something like one word or some word. And I think that the word of camp or encampment can be necessary, and we have to think about what concept we use to speak about it. Perhaps the problem with the translation from the philosophy to the social science is to apply with some excess of assujettissement, submission from the social scientists to what the philosophers say. Although you write in your paper that the proper Agamben say, oh no, it's not meant to be used for social science. It's different. It's not for social science. It's Deleuze was saying the same thing. Foucault was saying that, oh, you do whatever you want. It's not my problem with my concept. And that's why I allowed myself to use very much the heterotopy, for example. And I had a discussion with Alain Rossard, who's a Italian philosopher. And he told me, no, you cannot use heterotopy to speak about God. I said, yes, I can. I am allowed. I am authorized to, because for me, all this corresponds to some heterotopy. Why I say this? Because I think it can be interesting to not throw away completely the idea of exception in a situational, as you say, it is a situation of exception. It is not a state of exception. That's the problem of translating from philosophy to anthropology or to social science. When Agamben has been looking, or is still looking for something about the political or universal definition of exceptionality, when he speaks about Homo sapiens, he speaks about the state of exception. And we cannot do anything with it because it is hard too much. It is very hard to move it. I am a situationalist anthropologist, and you can observe some situation and say, okay, in this situation, this concept is working. And it's interesting to say that in the case of Roma, I think you're right, mainly in France, it's mostly the same. It's not exactly a situation, it's a situation of exception, or it's not a state of exception. Concerteza, absolutely, and perhaps a state of exception. Yeah, perhaps a space of exception can be a space of exception, but not always necessary. I thought it could be interesting to join three concepts together to speak about camps, encampment, exception, extraterritoriality, and exclusion. And then in the term of exclusion, perhaps Roma, or who is called Roma, or Roma migrants in Europe, can be understood through this main question of exclusion. Because if we have some juridical or political exceptionality, of course now, mainly with the European citizenship, then Roma are not in the exception. extraterritoriality. This is a discussion. What you say seems to mean that in the concrete condition of the people you are speaking about, there is not extraterritoriality. The debates which are in France are very interesting because this is a point of debate. Some people speak about bidonville and some people speak about camps, and who for the same spaces. And these spaces, they are something like small pieces of favela, or spread out 50, 100 people, 10, 15 families grouped in cabane, in house. Cabana, yes, cabana, not in caravan. And that's the point which is important, because the people who are in France considered like campement or migrant Roma, and about whom is applied the same discourse, or nearly the same discourse about the future of nomadism. They are not nomad, they are migrants coming from some part of Romania and willing to establish. And the very big part of them are established in apartments, in places, and they are a small part. Actually, it's very much open, but it's 17,000 people in France who are in something like 200 encampments, and it's very small encampments. Then the question which is for me interesting is, are these places bidonville, or are these places camps? And our French Minister of Interior used the word camp. And the associations and some social workers or some anthropologists, sociologists, they say, no, this is not a camp, this is a bidonville. And the difference is very important, because if you say it is a camp, then you are in the side of security and humanitarianism. And if you say it's a bidonville, then you are on the side of social problem and urban problem. And then we have all the memory in France about the bidonville de Nanterre, which is a very big urban problem. That is something in a certain way coming back. Say, oh, it's the problem of the bidonville which is coming back because of the policy of exclusion. And then it is important to say, oh, in this case, perhaps we are not in a situation of the camp, we are in a situation of exclusion, without exceptionality, without extraterritoriality, and something which is more like etc. Shantytown. Yeah. But big, small, very small shantytown. That's why it's also important to discuss, and perhaps you can give us more details, ethnographic detail of what kind of place are these exactly. Is it nomad camps? The camps is nomad, the camps move, or is it camp for nomads? Is it camp for people who are considered like nomad? Although, truly, perhaps they are not. Perhaps they are migrants. And then the policy of the Roma town or the government put them here. This is one point, and perhaps on this duality, the proper Roma people they can jouer avec les malentendus, play with the misunderstanding, use the misunderstanding. Some social workers want to help them because because of something with a passion for cultural difference, for example. And then they say, oh yes, you have a Roma culture, you must develop a Roma culture, different, etc., and then we will help you. Then you say, okay, that's okay. And then they can, people who, other people who say, we will help you to have a better condition of occupation because you are refugees. They say, okay, we are refugees. And they use all this discourse, and I think you're right. Perhaps the proper political subject emerge in the middle of this understanding as an autonomous. Is not exactly the cultural difference, one thing they are, and is not a refugee as others say. In your case, in the case where you speak about, it's a bit different, but he is in the middle, and he knows how to use all these languages to make a place to make his place, to make his own place in the situation. Yeah, that was my anyway.
So we will open it up for questions from moderators from here if necessary. Maybe you can introduce yourselves, because the speakers don't know you.
Hello, I'm Sarah, and I'm an Italian student coming from Rome. And I've been in contact with the situation with Roma people in Rome and the camps and the involvement of children in school. I've grown up with Roma children in my classrooms and experienced firsthand the discrimination. And I can't help but notice how popular perception of the community of Roma people influences the situation of the Roma. What I mean is, they are perceived popularly as a group of people who avoid being involved in working, and they are perceived negatively in a popular opinion in Rome, at least. And this contributes so much to their isolation from the community. So I was wondering, I've realized that I've been talking about Roma people so much more in American institutions than I have been Italian ones. And I've realized how Roman people, like the population, like regular, I don't know how to define it, but like the context I've grown up in has never discussed about the problem, though it always had it in front of their eyes. So I was wondering, how does popular perception of the Roma community play in the political way of dealing with it, in marginalizing these people in camps and making the number of camps smaller and smaller, and making people more and more prominent and perpetuating the situation?
Wait, do you want to take a few more? Yeah? Okay.
Very few contributions.
Anyone else want to go now, or Patrick and then Daniel?
I can do it.
Oh, go ahead.
So thank you for the talk, and I was wondering if you could maybe look at how, as you speak of Roma mainly, where there's also the term zinga is more the term that holds most of the derogatory connotations of the dirtiness. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. So, talk a little bit more about the. I can speak louder.
Just people can't hear it.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the differences between the two and how the individuals you spoke with identified as either or. Because even if we look at the term Rom or Roma becomes embedded with more of this humanitarian discourse as well. So the good Roma is being able to practice as to have like cultural practices that are that never that are never lost, even in migration. So like their musical values, their cultural values that are pan-European. But yeah, and also being able to integrate properly within society. So I was wondering if you could just do a little bit more on that. And then quickly, I also want to add, that's not just about exclusion, it's also a deferred inclusion. So they're never actually, the European Union has poured billions of dollars into the process of integrating or including the Roma within the various member states. But it's always, they come up with new programs of participatory action, Roma empowerment and inclusion, but it's always deferred. So I was wondering if you could comment on that as well.
I think we'll cut it off there. Yeah, and then we'll come back to other questions.
I do in reverse order. The point about the terms, obviously this was a paper and been writing about this thing for the last 10 years. Initially was very much interested in the nomad as a ethno-name and in relation to Zingari. And it's quite interesting how these terms have a different connotation in each country. And I was at some point on the Council of Europe expert group on Roma, Sinti travelers, Manouche, and they got 6-7 names one after the other. And it was very interesting to see the fights between the Italian representatives of the Romani communities with the Irish travelers or the English gypsies about how they would determine which was acceptable, what's not. The term nomadic for the Irish travelers was actually very positive compared to... Now if you go to Italy, you give a talk. I mean, I've been... For many years I had the double hat, the activist and the academics. So one thing you learn very soon is that you cannot go in any conference like this and mention even the word Zingari or nomadi once, because basically everything you say doesn't count anymore after that. So you get interrupted, which is quite interesting in the process, because the term Roma has become it was not like that when I started in the late 1990s, but now it's really become very strong, and even newspapers managed to get, start recognizing it. What is interesting is that the term Roma, though, if you look at not an Italian perspective, but in a European perspective, is loaded with meaning. The Roma as a pan-European identity has been constructed since 70s, 1970s in a strong way. There was the International Romani Union Conference in London. They invented a national anthem. They invented the flag. They commissioned the French linguist to start to standardize language because obviously the Romanes has got Spanish. So it's very interesting. It's a very political identity. So it's actually very interesting to play with this fluidity of the term. When you shift the scale, things change. So when I did my initial work was about these regional norms that I mentioned at the beginning. And some of them, each of them use a different definition of the target group. So that the Roma, Sinti, even Zingari in the law is written down. Is that term. And some of the legislation, like the one of the Lombard region, says that defining, because basically in the regional norm initially they have to say who are they targeting to. So they say, are nomads those that are called nomads? That's how they define it. It's actually a perfect tautological definition of the target group. Doesn't mean anything. And then they also acknowledge for the semi-nomads, which is interesting. It's a semi-feminine and semi-nomads. They don't define it. Anyway, so that's another term. It's a really important, interesting issue there. Which takes me to the point about the camps, the nomad camps of the camps for nomads. But it's a kind of a long story, but in these regional norms where based on the idea there were two different kinds of camps. There were camps for settled nomads, which is spent time like oxymorons, and camps for transit camp for nomads. So they said they were already sort of saying, if you are really a mobile person, you can go in these areas, which is really thought for Italian Sinti that would tend to move having a kind of more itinerant lifestyle, working with circus and things like that. And for the one instead who were settled, they were having these kind of nomad camps, but they were actually one of the strange things is that you get an entitlement to a place in a nomad camps if you have been in the place for a long time. If the people that end up in a nomad camps, they were sitting in the parking side outside for years without moving. And the point about the nomad camps, it actually immobilized the Roma, which is quite interesting about this sense of if you are really mobile, you cannot go in nomad camp because you lose the right to your place if you live in the place for more than 2-3 weeks. So it's quite interesting. Paradoxical play of discourse and policy that is quite interesting. So it's a camp for nomads, inverted commas, but you cannot do inverted commas all the time. So that's one element there. Another point I wanted to make was about this idea of, I really like the point about the real political subjectivity emerged from in the spaces of being able to play with those identities. I mean, when you start to gain the space and the power to be able to play with that identity means that you start to build that political subjectivity. When it's all imposed and you have no room for maneuvering, it's clearly a sign. The point I wanted to make about this, recently there has been a major scandal in Italy, which was called Mafia Capitale. And it was in Rome. As it turned out, they did some phone tapping, and they came up that one of the big business of this mafia organization, crime organized group in Rome, was the management of detention center for migrants, nomad camps, and all the people at the margin of society. And these were people that were very central in the political administration of Rome, of the capital. So it's quite interesting, the link between the margin and the center there. Very interesting, because in a way, there was, when I say about we need to de-exceptionalize the camp, it's exactly that. The camps are really central in the economy. They really play a function, and they are served, and the reproduction of the nomads serves a very somehow core function of the political system. So, as a sociologist or as a social scientist, I'm interested in that, and my concern is that if I apply the exceptional categories, I miss the point. I don't really understand that. I cannot explain it. And the other element is that since 2008, partly when it was also the time in which in France there were this function of Romania Roma that were put on the bus and paid the tickets, and then they were coming back, they were paid the ticket again, and then they were blamed because they were exploiting the system and getting paid more than one. So at that time, there were pogrom in Italy of Roma camps and fire. Unfortunately, I had photos as mentioned. And the way that the population of Roma started to be governed was through emergency decree. So this emergency decree, they use a language, by definition it's an emergency decree, normally applied at time of war. However, these are emergency decree with the small letters, not capital letters, and they are issued by the Prime Minister, not by the President of the Republic. So very easy, they are not law, but they basically create a space for intervention that gives special power to the prefecture against the local authorities. The fact is that these special powers have been renewed over the years on the basis that the Roma were an emergency and were exception. But to the point that if you look at the documents are just a photocopy every year without any factual element. So there is not, because these are Roma, there is not even a need to justify the fact that they are an emergency or they're exception. So this is why there's the constructive exceptionality, and this is where I'm coming from into some of the term. So the situation of Roma is particularly interesting, obviously because it's the place where there's the largest number of Roma people, and historically there has been there both Italian national and from Yugoslavia and now from Romania, so there are the two major groups. About the issues of the prejudice against the Roma, in Italy is one of the strongest in Europe according to Eurobarometers and Barad Studies Commission. What's interesting is that all the elements that come out in terms of what it's justified is mainly through the camp. So it's the dirtiness in the camp. It's the camp where the Roma make noise. What is always absent in the public imagination around this group is the one that don't live in camps. That basically you almost lose the entitlement to call yourself Roma if you don't live into a camp. And a very small anecdote. Once I was in a meeting of the Council of Europe regional authorities, and in Rome, so there was the local councillor for social issues there, and there was the mayor of Shutorizzari, that is a neighborhood of Skopje in Macedonia, that has a majority of the population of the Roma people. So this guy is a Roma himself. So there was all the people talking there, and this guy was giving a brilliant speech, fluent English, so much better than one of the representatives of the local authorities. At the end of it, the local council was speaking in the microphone said, "Sorry, sir, are you sure you're a Roma?" This was said, there was even translators there. I mean, this is a completely, shameless way of doing it, but it really tells you something about this petition and the fact that if you don't comply with it, you don't exist. Yeah, so that's. I'll stop you for now, because otherwise I can go on,
Thank you. Daniel, anyone else? Okay.
So try to speak up or take a mic.
That's good.
Yeah, okay. I can speak even louder if need be. Yeah. Thanks again for Miriam and organizing that into both our speakers. When you talk about exceptions, I think it's very interesting, the narrative here, that normally camps are exceptions because people who are living in camps don't live in camps. But here we have this narrative that we're creating a situation of normalcy for these people who are nomads and who anyway like living in camps. It's an exception from how we live, but for them it's not an exception. That's how I understand the narrative that was underpinning this, and that's very interesting. I would like to know more about the initial setting up, the narrative, the initial stages of the narrative. Did the authorities do some assessments? Were they then naive? Did they co-opt this kind of strategic ingenuity? Which like, okay, you guys are nomads, we actually don't want to integrate you, we don't want to have expensive housing, so it fits well into our own ideas. Is that what happened? Or was it just like this idea of we don't want to, the humanitarian idea, we don't want to come with our norms and we actually want to help you? We heard about people who want to stay there because it's safe haven. But what about contestation? What about people who do not want to live there and people who want to live, say half of them are living outside? What about legal status? People who actually get the secure status elsewhere. How do they interact with people in the camps? And how do this affect the general narratives? And the last question that I have is, in the very beginning of the presentation, you mentioned identity and the bureaucratic identity, and I'm thinking of Zetter and the labeling processes and ciphers of his refugees. Do you find that the labeling of these nomads has an impact on claims making? That these people that have been labeled for 15 years or whatever, does this create an identity that actually they use this to make claims in addition to that?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a student at the Sociology Department. So I had a question regarding the genealogy of these camps and shanty towns in Italy, because it's difficult for me to, in a way, detach what's happening, so what you said that started in the 90s after the Balkan Wars, with the mobility of people from the Mezzogiorno going to Milan and Rome, and living in shanty towns built on mills during the 60s and 70s. And how a similar discourse is ascribed to them, and this was popularized by Ettore Scola's movie The Brutis Porci Cattivi, and in a way, of course these are different things, but shouldn't also be talking about a genealogy or at least a connection between these two kind of processes? Thank you.
Miracolo Milano is also fascinating.
Yeah, also.
Go ahead.
The PhD thesis was an exploration of the experiences of Roma people that were living in camps and those who had left and living in flats. So there was about, it was very much based on the idea of Lisa Marti about the national order of things within camp and one outside, and really exploring the way they were playing with their identities initially. The other dimension was working with Roma, the Kosovo Roma, and this is actually to back also where you said, I was working with a group called the Roma, Ascalia, and Egyptians. So very few people know about, there is an acronym called RAI that was these groups that if you go to Kosovo, they all got their identities that was created after the war, they had invented things, and then I was trying to see if they had any significance within the Italian context. I managed to get the Ascalia, but no Egyptian, himself in my interviews. So it's quite interesting. And starting by, obviously, you picked up the Roger Zette work. I mean, Roger Zette was my supervisor on the thesis, and so I've been working, it started a lot around this issue of the labeling, iconographic labeling, and explore the relationship between the ethnic label normal thing applied and the refugee label, and now I was playing with these groups in particular. Just in a couple of months ago, I was back in Florence while I was doing my visiting fellowship there. I went to the camp. I went to a zikir. I don't know if you know about this. It's basically in one of the camps in Florence. There is a Sufi. There is one of the few Roma sheikh dervish that's in Europe. Basically, they are very few. So they have this every Saturday. I was invited to one of the rituals. I went there. It was hours. And what is interesting was to see that people were coming from outside. So they kept the mosque within the camp. And most of the people that were at the mosque that Saturday night, they actually now live in flats. But the camp is still kept this role of almost a piazza. So in a sense, they are reproducing the Italian piazza within the camp. So again, about the embeddedness and the way that the place gets actualized. It was fascinating to see, you know, that people, they say, no, once in the weekend, we always go to campus with friends, rather than being a sad local authorities, flat kind of idea. But it was quite interesting with the relationship between legality and legality. Being undocumented or with a very precarious status outside campus is very difficult for them. And then obviously this tapping into all the issues about structural discrimination, very difficult access to the job market, and issues like that. So in a sense, their position, they end up stuck in the camp, in the sense of and the camp produces an economy. I will mention the bright market, but there is many more informal sector that don't go, there is a spectrum of possibility there. The point about the bill is in the genealogy. I've written a few things about that in the sense of the history of the Roma camps in Italy. It's quite interesting. There are various genealogy. An historian called Luca Bravi and also Matteo Sanfilippo, they worked on the fact that it was interesting that some of the fascist concentration camps, they have been reused in following years to hosting Roma. So later on, basically, the place has been resignified. They took out the labor from outside and became an area where they were. So it's quite interesting to see these continuities. When I started my work, I was fascinated by the idea of the comparison of people in the bidonville, particularly with Milan, and found very little. Also because in some of the camps, not the formal one, not one led by local authorities, but the informal one that looked more like bidonville or like shanty-town. They are not all inhabited by Roma. You know, if there are, especially the new one with Romanian Roma, there is also plenty of Romanians that are not Roma. There used to be Moroccan migrants, and they were basically the first call of entry when people were coming and didn't know where to go in some cases. There was space for informality, that people were self-building their sort of little houses on one floor. Inside they had all very nice embroideries and they looked fantastic. It's always quite, it's very hard when you try to theorize to manage to do justice to the variety of this somehow configuration of the camps. Because one thing is those container, you know, the one made with the corrugated iron, and another thing is something self-built using garbage and doors and pieces of that you have shaped yourself, you position the way you like with your friends and family around, and there is different geographies. What is interesting is that the way once the state intervened, they apply different rationality. They built those big camps like one in Castel Romano, which looks like a military things, because then they apply the security and control mentality into so it's quite interesting to map the transition and transformation of the camp forms. And this is about historicity, you know, that I'm interested in. And what tells me about also shift in the transformation of citizenship and membership, because, you know, one of the problems I have with Agamben that a lot of his theorizing is based on the idea of a very normative understanding of the rule of law, as if there is a perfect citizenship and these are the exception. The way I see it, also because maybe I'm not working with Roma, with undocumented migrants, with children, newcomers, stateless people, there is such a, the exception seems to be much bigger than the normalcy to an extent, and we need to acknowledge it.
Michelle, do you want to add anything to close the discussion?
No, that's great. No, I think it's very, very interesting. Perhaps to reconsider the possible use of the word and the idea of camp or encampment. Perhaps we need to forget a bit about them and look to the variety of the situation in the world where this encampment for Rome is just a little part of what I've called the urban encampment. And this encampment is a very small part of a huge planet of camps. And you have the urban encampment, who is for migrants who find no place in the city or in centrally in the state, and you have the borders encampment for all the migrants who don't succeed to cross the border, which are difficult to cross, and then this creates new encampment. And you have the refugees camps, and you have the IDP camps, and you have the transit zone, and you have the retention centers, and now you have also many workers in camps. And I think all this makes something like a planet of camps, which is very diverse, very big diversity, and in the same time, all this is something which is about camps, putting apart, you know? And that's the point I think is important, and it is the context which gives a certain specific meaning to the situation of Rome in Italy or in France, where the idea to take them apart always comes with the idea of a camp, not just for them, separate. The idea of the camp is used to separate a certain kind of population. It's at the same time it's a very global problematic, and it's in each time a very local problematic. The global is very local.
Well, before we give them a final thank you, I want to invite you all to join us for our reception. We have food and wine outside. It's coming in.
We can bring in, I guess.
It's coming in. Okay, so I hope you have some time to stay with us and chat over some cookies and wine. Thank you so much, Nando.